How many heard the postlude today in church? Dr. Pennebaker was much younger when I met him, and Paul Mines did a hymn festival for us at 2 different churches, so 4 times I had the joy of having Paul Mines in my congregation. And on the Monday after one of those hymn festivals, I met Dr. Mons for breakfast and took him to BWI to fly back to Minneapolis. And he had been to church the morning before where Dr. Pennebaker played. I'm trying to knock this over ceremoniously this time. Dr. Pennebaker had been organist at the service that morning, the previous day, and Dr. Mons said to me at breakfast, "That man is better than I ever was at his age." You heard that man play this morning. Dr. Mons was a good friend. Well, that's all I can say. It's just a joy to hear Jeff tackle Mons' music, and he did that this morning with great talent. Now, me and this coffee cup will do war again, no doubt. Technically, Thanksgiving has never been a church holiday. It has always been a national holiday. It's in a weekday, never on a Sunday. And I ask you before the saints, what's a preacher supposed to do with a secular holiday? That really isn't secular, because we're giving thanksgiving to the God we all worship. So today I beg your forbearance if I talk a little bit about history in my own career, about Thanksgiving, and then trace it hopscotch down through the years a little bit, until frankly I got bored by it, so I was suspecting you would be too. And then back to Thanksgiving today and what we do with it. So that's kind of what I want to do today. Thank you again, Linda, for being our narrator. You'll want to pull the microphone up close as they have me doing, because I think our audiovisual team is caught with those who stick the microphone in their mouth while they sing and talk and this kind of thing on television. So that's what we have to do here. My. Do you know this is the next to the last in this series? Next Sunday we'll do Christ the King. And then we'll start 3 Sundays. You say, well, there's 4 Sundays in Advent. Why not 4 Sundays? Because all 4 Sundays are in December. And the 4th Sunday of Advent is the 24th of December, which is Christmas Eve. And I have a feeling that we'll not have Sunday school that morning. I never thought I would like being in a church where we would cancel Sunday school, but it's getting more comfortable for me. Last night's crisis was Doris, what she wonderfully does, got on the phone and ordered the next day delivery of a carton of paper, because as you might guess, running about 40 or 45 of these a week, and this one's 11 pages, so you go through a ream of paper very fast. So I buy it by the carton, and so as I started down the basement, I said, I don't remember the paper ever arriving. And it hadn't. So at 7 o'clock last night, when I should have been printing this and mailing it out to you, I had to drive out to Staples in Laurel and buy paper so I could do that printing. So, Lord Jesus, give us one Saturday night that's normal. That's all I ask. It's so good to see you. God love you for being so faithful. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
And let us pray. Merciful and gracious Lord, this is the week of Thanksgiving. This is the week when, in so many ways, we ought to be in our churches, and most of us won't be. And that's changed over the years. And one wonders how we get it back. By the gift of your Spirit, Lord, give us thankful hearts again, and show us maybe how that's done. These things we ask in the name of our blessed Savior, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. You know, I don't know whether it was working out a vengeance toward this younger pastor, or maybe it was God's incredible sense of humor. But somehow the call came at the age of 26, just out of seminary, to a little town in Centre County, Pennsylvania, right smack in the middle, north, south, east, west of Pennsylvania, in the mountains, 7 valleys, and a place, to be frank with you, this city boy who lived in Tidewater, 4 blocks from the largest shipyard on the East Coast, who always saw the milk arrive on the front porch in a glass bottle with the cream sitting on top of it. That's all I knew about where that milk came from. And suddenly I find myself in a little town of about 1,000 people called Millheim, the home of mills, and surrounded in this valley by a whole lot of Lutheran farmers, all of whom were graduates of Penn State University, or nearly all of them, and they did farming with books, not just touch. They were on the numbers always. That was the first thing I didn't expect. Then they quickly realized that this young pastor knew nothing about farming. Not a drip. And had no particular respect for it either. That looked like to me harder work than I wanted to have to do. So they proved to me that it was. They invited me out to the farms, and the only one I never got invited to was the day they slaughtered, because they figured a young pastor couldn't handle that. You were right, I couldn't. I still can't handle it today. Our grandson saw the turkey come out of the oven one Thanksgiving some years ago when he was probably 8 or 10 years old. And he says, "Grandma, was that alive?" And she said, "Yes," and he wouldn't eat dinner. Anyhow, they would invite me out. When they were making hay, they'd invite me out and give me one of the jobs. I could walk along the wagon where they were stacking the hay, pick up the hay bales that came out of the baling machine, and throw them up to the wagon. And I did about one trip down the field with that, and I couldn't lift the hay bale anymore. So they said, "Well, why don't you ride?" Well, I'd only caught 3 or 4, and the 5th one knocked me off the other side of the wagon. So then they told me just to ride the wagon and watch, and then we got to the barn to unload the wagon, and they said, "You go up in the mouth of the barn. Man, is it hot up there. And you catch the bales and stack them." Well, you're stacking, stack upon stack upon stack. Pretty soon, every time you walk, your foot goes down between stacks of bales, and you're suddenly sprawled out. It was hard just to keep up with those guys. And they did this not one day, but several days in a row. It was what they did. Then I would learn that they got up on Sunday morning well before sunrise. They had 100 head of cows. They would get up before sunrise. David, his son John, and his youngest son David Jr. They would get up well before dawn and milk the cows on Sunday and then be in church for Sunday school and church. Never failed. And I was astounded. I mean, shirt and tie and everything, not a flannel shirt from having milked the cows. Others did the same thing. Some were just wise people giving me advice. You know, when you're going back and forth in a field all day for several days, you got a lot of time to think. Because what you had to do was drive a straight line in that field while you were harvesting. But that doesn't require a lot. It requires, but it gives you time to think. And they were often there at my side when I had a decision to make. Maybe you don't want to help, Pastor, but the way we see it, and boy, was I glad to have that help. But one day, David said to me, just in passing, well, tomorrow I'm going to go to the bank and see my banker friend and borrow $5,000. That was more than my salary that year, for the whole year. Borrow $5,000 for seeds to plant for next year's crop. And as he's walking away from that conversation, he says to me, or just to whomever's listening, I hope it rains a little less this coming year, because corn doesn't like wet feet. I have never, ever forgotten that. For the first time in my life as a young man, I thought in terms of the risk every farm owner takes with the change of the seasons. He plows the field, he fertilizes the field, he plants the seeds, he drags the plow, or really a hoe, in rows that the tractor can drag between the rows of young plants to keep the weeds down. And he harvests it. But he won't do any of those things if it doesn't rain in the right amounts at the right time. Then I began to understand why David and his family were always in church on Sunday. Because there was no way to get around the truth that they were doing this farming, but they were doing it in partnership with God, or God was working in partnership with them. They didn't care which way it went. But it was a fact of their lives that I had never encountered before in my life, because it came with a horse-drawn cart and was put on my front porch, and it was a bottle of milk, and that's all I knew about it. Never seen a cow in my life. Well, that relationship has never evaporated from my mind. I'll talk about it again, but just to give you, by way of introduction, the impact those 4 years had on my life. When I resigned to take another call in the city, unanimously the church council asked me to change my mind. I finally didn't, and they was as gracious as they've been before. I share that with you now because Thanksgiving is about harvesting, and it's about something we don't know much about because we live in the city. We really don't know much about it. we wouldn't understand that the Hostemans kept a file from birth of every cow in their herd. They were the only farmer in Penns Valley that had a 100% Guernsey herd. You remember when Guernsey used to be really what you wanted until we found out about butterfat? Because you got a little more per pound weight from the processors if it was pure Guernsey. So David had a Guernsey. He used to say he didn't have much respect for Holstein because it was those, you could tell the difference between a pail of Holstein and a pail of Guernsey because you could throw a 50-cent piece in a pail of Holstein and you could read "In God We Trust." They were my first parishioners. They taught me so much. In the fall, we would have a harvest home service. I had no respect for it at all, but we had a harvest home service when the farm families would haul to the church the canned vegetables and fruits in those ball glass jars with brass or zinc lids on them. You remember those kind of things? That's hard work. We had a fellow brought us a bushel of tomatoes, and Doris made tomato juice. She's never done it again. But here was the church. You could hardly walk in the aisles and in the chancel. There would be tables and tables and tables of home canned goods. Colorful, immense. They would not be taken home again. The next day they would be taken to the old folks' homes of the church and to the children's homes of the church until the state stopped us because they didn't know how to inspect all the kitchens that were involved in making this. So they stopped us. But it was a tithe. It was part of the tithe of that. They didn't ask for it back. They intended it to go to the homes. And they sang Thanksgiving hymns, and we sang, "Oh God, our help in ages past." You sang it this morning. Our help for years to come, our shelter in the stormy blast, and our eternal home. They knew who they were. And they knew who their partner was. And there was no questioning. In fact, we never had trouble raising money. All you had to say was the furnace needed to be replaced at the church. And the farmers would start how much do you need? Those that had it. They were Pharisees about paying national church benevolence. Church councilmen competed with each other, those in office and those out of office, about how much they overpaid the apportionment. Absolute Pharisees. What a place to learn ministry. The Harvest Home Service was the conclusion of the year. And they even tithe what they can. And I'm standing kind of in awe. I had never seen anything like this. That was Thanksgiving. There aren't any harvest home services of those types anymore because nobody wants the food. They'd love to have it, but the laws are what they are. So we don't have tables like these stacked high like a grocery store in clear glass jars of home canned foods. But it was part of what it meant to be in Penns Valley, Pennsylvania, working in God's field. and it was tied in to their worship. I didn't understand that for the first couple of years, but it dawned on me. So I wanted to share that with you because I want to come back to that in a moment. But now I want to talk a little bit about this whole issue of, and I'm on page 3 if you're wondering where I'm going. By the way, I might as well, while I'm paused here, make a comment about some other things in your paper. Right in the smack middle of this paper, there is, so on page 5, and there are 10 pages. On page 5, right up at the top third, you'll see a line that's got one line right on top the other. So if you see that, if anybody here can read it, it's called an unknown tongue. Known only to the software people who designed the material I used. I don't know how that happened, nor did I know how to unwind it. So you've got it the way it is. And then on the last next to the last page, yeah, line 10, page 10, at the bottom, just a doodad to fill things. This is a picture of loading tobacco on a ship at Jamestown, Virginia, in about 1650. And what they're loading is tobacco. I had no idea that Jamestown was exporting tobacco by 1650. To the early 1600s. But there it says losing it, and they're not losing it, they're loading it. That's my mistake, fat-fingered no. All right, now let's go on. I mentioned the importance of the Harvest Home Festival, that's page 2. Going on to page 3, we come to the great argument settled by John F. Kennedy in his Thanksgiving proclamation when he officially recognized there were 2 first Thanksgivings, one in Plymouth with the Puritans, and that's the one we all know about. And by the way, on the front page there's a picture, and if you note, that picture was painting on oil on canvas. You don't know that, but you see the year 1925 in the caption. So that's not an Eastman photograph picture of the first Thanksgiving of the Puritans, but it's this artist's second try. Her first one was in 1918, and it was so maligned because it was historically incorrect that she painted it again in 1925. But this one's incorrect too, because now we know they didn't have tables at this particular one. Okay. But there are no Eastman Kodak pictures. Most of us know about the Thanksgiving at the Puritans in Massachusetts, in a location not far from Boston. But most of us probably don't know about the Berkeley 100 plantation on the James River that 2.5 years approximately before the Pilgrims had the first particular thing. And we talk about here, all the reasons for those early settlers to have Thanksgivings, and they had them. And maybe I can get Linda here to read the bullets there for us. These are all the reasons they'd have Thanksgiving. And what was like David and his farm, they were spontaneous Thanksgivings. If you'd been at sea for 2 months, crossing the Atlantic, surviving storms, there's no happier person in the whole world than you are when you set your foot on dry land And you don't have to go back out there. You didn't have to say, you ought to be thankful. They were. So these Thanksgiving services were relatively spontaneous and highly popular for a number of reasons. As the bullets give us those reasons, we don't fall if you would.
The moment of stepping off the boat and onto dry land, we have historical records of services of Thanksgiving, some spontaneous and others planned on the occasions of landing. Thanksgiving for survival of the first winter. Thanksgiving for a peaceful relationship with local Indian tribes. Thanksgiving for a good harvest looking into fall and winter. Thanksgiving for arrival of cargo ships with food and supplies. Thanksgiving for the arrival of ships with new settlers. Thanksgiving for arrival of ships with supplies, food, and medicine.
These kind of spontaneous moments, the arrival of a ship, smoking the peace pipe, and I had a picture of that. Not Eastman Kodak either. That's if Doc Fowler didn't choose to use it. But there were just a good harvest, an end of a conflict with an Indian tribe, smoking a peace pipe, settling an issue with people you needed. And remember now, over in the Middle East right now, there's a war going on, you know that. And part of the reason of that war is when you create a new nation in an occupied land, you put somebody out of their house. That's still what this is about there. The Palestinians and the Arab world didn't accept the UN partition for their half of the Holy Land because it was their homes that were in that half. The Indians had the same reaction. You know, they weren't bright enough. They were awed by the ships, the big sails. But some understood from the outset, they'll take our land. They're going to stay. So there were those times of conflict and those times of celebration. But just to get our history in line, we did take their land. We put them on plantations, sometimes not their native land at all. I remember being in Herodium, outside of Bethlehem, and we just had a terrible conflict with a sudden uprising of Palestinians and a number of Israeli Defense Force people. That was Herod's Mountain, by the way. We had, and I went there just a few days after this, and I'm walking up the pathway, climbing the mountain, and I meet my first sentries, armed to the teeth. And I said to them, you know, someday you're going to have to give some of this back. And he said to me, let me know when you give the land back to the Indians, and we'll do the same. So much for being wise in the Middle East. But that's what's happening here. We are moving in on their turf. They are nations. Canada's got a better feel for this when they call them First Nations rather than Indians. But Columbus thought he had found a new route to India, so he called them Indians, and we've called them Indians ever since. But this is not India. Never has been. It's uncomfortable sometimes running history over again. Anyhow, we've moved in most of the time until the time of the Civil War, just before. Most of the time, they stayed friendly. The Indians showed us how to survive in this land. They gave us corn. They didn't have mashed potatoes because potatoes were imported later than the first Thanksgiving. All kinds of fun stuff you dig up that you didn't know before. Anyhow, this Berkeley plantation is an interesting thing, and I'll go now and ask, and this is where, no. This is where we have and if you'll turn to page 4 for just a second, and Linda's going to start on page 3, but you'll see over here a roadside plaque, and you'll say, if you were going to print that, you should have printed it large enough that we can read it. So if you look on page 10, you'll find it in legible sight. Is it 10? 11. I lied. And that one you can read, but we'll let Linda read part of the history, which is a little more informative than that. Sorry.
The ship Margaret from Bristol, England, sailed for Virginia under Captain John Woodliff and brought 38 settlers to the new town and 100 of Berkeley. The London Company proprieties instructed the settlers that the day of our ship's arrival shall be yearly and perpetually kept as a day of Thanksgiving. The Margaret landed her passengers at Berkeley 100 on December 4th, 1619. The settlers did indeed celebrate a day of Thanksgiving, establishing the tradition 2 years and 17 days before the Pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower at Plymouth, Massachusetts, to establish their Thanksgiving Day in 1621. Thanksgiving occasions remain locally popular at harvest times and at other times, such as those times of gratitude when getting off the boat. These are those traditions in such states as Texas and Florida, as well as others, but they remain largely local celebrations. That is until after the War of Independence of the colonies from Great Britain.
Again, getting history into perspective for us. You know, I kind of grew up with my school education thinking that Columbus came in 1492, we say the ocean blue and all that. And then, shortly after that, we had the War of Independence. And shortly after that, so forth. Actually, we were the 13 colonies for almost as long as we've been the United States. Not quite as long, but it's rather close. 1776 is almost the end of the 18th century. That's when we won the War of Independence. But we arrived in the 1600s, the early 1600s. The period of Thanksgiving was 1621. And the one in not far from Jamestown on the in Virginia along the James River, it's a strange name, Berkeley 100. Actually, it was something like 10,000 acres. It's in your paper, and I may not be remembering that correctly. It was huge. It is now an entire county in Virginia. That was a plantation. And that's where they had, 2 years before the Pilgrims did it, the first English-speaking Thanksgiving in the New World. What difference it makes, I don't know. But it was John Kennedy that kind of drew our attention to it in his Thanksgiving proclamation. He recalls these two events. Why didn't I print that for you? I lost it. We go on down then, so still on page 4, we talk about President Washington, George Washington, proclaiming a day of thanksgiving at the behest of the Congress. The Congress agreed on things on those days. Not so much now. He does this at the behest of, and he allowed Congress to set what day it was. On October 3rd, he did the proclamation. At the end of your paper, you have the entirety of George Washington's proclamation of 1785 or something like that. And it's so germane, as I read through it, it's so germane to where we are right now about what the issues are, that it's worth reading. I printed it in 14-point type to make it real easier. But we won't read that today. We're not going to have time to do it. But it's in your paper. John Adams, to follow George Washington, declared 2 days of thanksgiving. They're not yet annual. Washington will proclaim 2 Thanksgiving celebrations. The Continental Congress, before there is a president, the Continental Congress will do that as well. So Thanksgiving was a tradition that started and kind of on the occasion when you set foot on land, when a ship arrived, when medicines came, when food came, when a peace treaty was made, all down the East Coast, it was a practice of holding these almost spontaneous moments of Thanksgiving. I say, why was the East Coast? That's about as far at this point as we had penetrated into the continent. Anyhow, having said that, then, you know, Thomas Jefferson has become more controversial in more recent years, but he was a deist. And the best way I could explain a deist, he wrote it, when you go to Monticello, they'll tell you about how he was such a religious man, he wrote his own Bible. He took in the books he liked, he threw out the ones he didn't, and it was Thomas Jefferson's Bible. But he was a deist. Now, how can I describe a deist? A deist is a god. You're not questioning God. You're just questioning where God is today. God created it. He flung it into space, perhaps. You got no better answer. But it's a little like a kid who on Christmas morning finds an electric train around the Christmas tree, and for the first 3 hours of Christmas, he sits there just watching like this. Then he gets up and goes somewhere else and never again turns the train on all day. That's a deist idea of God. He was here once. He was very involved once. And Thomas Jefferson not only didn't proclaim Thanksgiving when a Baptist society begged him to do it, and gave a rather well thought out, not surprising for Thomas Jefferson, rather well thought out of how that was incongruous with the separation of church and state in this new country. Anyway, it's been fun. Now we come over to Lincoln's proclamation, and I felt that was worth reading, and it's on page 5, and that's where the software began having its problems. I wanted to indent that whole section. It not only didn't indent the whole section, it put part of it out to the margins and then typed one line over another line. So I've asked Linda to read the first indented paragraph and then to put an N, capital N, on the not indented paragraph so that it starts a new sentence and read from there down to the bottom. And that'll be that's not quite all of Abraham Lincoln's proclamation, but it's worth hearing because he talks about the war isn't over yet, but it's 2 years from over. And so things are going pretty well for the Union forces by this time. And that's reflected in this rather archaic language, but I think interesting proclamation.
In the midst of a civil war of
Oh, excuse me. Notice I haven't dumped it over yet.
Okay, I'm not sure where it goes. Just read it, okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and provoke their aggression, peace has been preserved with all nations, the order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere except in the theater of military conflict. While that area has been greatly, national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines, as well as of the iron and coal as of the precious metals, have metals yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. The population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increases of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the higher God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy. It has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged as with one heart and voice by the whole American people. I do hereby invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States to set apart and to observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. In testimony whereof I have herewith set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington, this 3rd day of October, and the year of our Lord, 1863, and of the independence of the United States, the 88th. Proclamation of President Abraham Lincoln, October 3rd, 1863.
And look now right at the paragraph that follows that in 13-point type. Thanksgiving Day has been celebrated annually since 1863. Remember, the Civil War didn't really end until 1865. 1863 in the United States. Then the next is very interesting. By the way, it replaced the celebration of Evacuation Day on November 25th, celebrated each year until the Civil War. It celebrated the British evacuation of troops from the United States after the American Revolution. Evacuation Day, have you ever heard of that? That's still worth celebrating, I guess, I don't know. All right, now skipping to the present. I got a Currier and Ives picture because it's the way we all think of the old days of Thanksgiving. And when I was in Penns Valley, they used to tell me that it snowed so much. How much did it snow? It snowed so much that they could ride the sleigh over the fences in the field to go from one farm to the other. Of course, a lot of horses broke their legs, but that picture, I thought, it's Thanksgiving. I gotta stick Currier and Ives in there somewhere. When I arrived at the parish in Metro DC area, I found that they had on Thanksgiving Day 2 services in the morning in order to handle a comfortably filled nave for both services. It started in the parlor with warm cider. People were gathered there and so forth, and then they were ushered into the nave, and then in full uniform, retired or active military duty, a person read the proclamation that had come to them from the White House. It was not the one we stole out of the newspaper. And So the proclamation was read, and then there was I don't know, I'd say a Paul Mines kind of prelude of a Thanksgiving hymn, which would be in procession, and then the crucifer, torchbearers, a appropriately former or current military person bore the flag down the center aisle. Then came the choir, full choir on Thanksgiving Day, that's impressive. Full congregation on Thanksgiving, more impressive. And then the choir, and then I say the clergy or one of the chancel attendants. And then they would do it all over again an hour and a half later. I don't know whether that happens now or not. But it was that popular then. Since that time, more and more congregations have gone to shared services the night before, and they're not really attended either. And now I see some just not mentioned in the newspaper. What's happened? Well, what's happened? 1924, Macy had its first Thanksgiving Day parade with floating balloons in the air, and there's a picture of one of those there from, I think I got a date on it, 1979. But that's not the first. The first one was in Philadelphia, the Mummers Parade. I didn't have a picture of that. That wasn't too bad when it started because the only people could see it were who? Those standing on the sidewalk until television came, and then until color television came, and now they're both of them are broadcast from coast to coast. It is awfully good reason to have a second state. There are still some who have Thanksgiving. In fact, Thanksgiving dinners are still exceedingly popular. And here's one in 1942. And it looks like they are seriously involved in prayer. They should have been. That was the second year of the Second World War. It was not a good time for us on land or at sea. But then there's always been, and I'll talk about one I know most about. For 12 years as bishop, I was invited. And I was invited after too, but I didn't do it. For 12 years as bishop, I was invited to serve at Georgetown Lutheran Church at the Thanksgiving dinner for the homeless. They never made you show a homeless card. Just anybody who came was welcome. They exceeded 200 every year. Let me tell you about Georgetown. It is the oldest congregation, historically speaking, in the Metro DC area. That's because Georgetown was in existence and thriving before there was a Washington. It was Washington. Well, Georgetown goes back to those beginnings. It's the oldest congregation in our city. By the same token, it is probably, by a measure, one of the very smallest of our congregations. And yet, they have, for the 12 years I was bishop and a long time before then, had this Thanksgiving dinner that feeds more than 200 people, and they do this as well. They feed them as much as they want. Now these are hungry people. They feed them as much as they want until it's all. They will pack lunches for the day and tomorrow, the next day, as much as they can carry out. And they do it every year. What a joy it was to be serving at that time, to have the opening prayer. So they could say, the bishop is here. The only time bishop ever came to Georgetown was usually when they were in trouble over something. So this they were celebrating. I don't have a picture of it. I have a picture of another one in Eugene, Oregon. But just to comment that we haven't lost it all. And we haven't lost the feastness of it. Doris told me that Tim is bringing our son, our second child, is bringing the turkey. It's going to be a 20-pound turkey. He also will come and roast that turkey if Doris stuffs it with the Krispy Kreme donut stuffing that she makes. We will meet a son-in-law to be for the first time. We'll have our granddaughter with him. We will have around the table, how many Doris? 11 around the table. And what I have to tell you while I'm on it is, look at the clock. Last week, our former daughter-in-law who lives in Jacksonville, granddaughter, right, what am I saying? Who lives in Jacksonville, Florida, came up just to spend the day with the two children, our great-grandchildren, just to spend the day with Grandma and Granddad. And she decided not to ride, bring two children, one is 1 year old, the other is 3 years old, on an airplane on the Thanksgiving holidays. But we had all day with our great-grandchildren. The day week before Thanksgiving, they're the only ones, almost the only ones that will be there Thanksgiving. So we're looking forward to it, and it is a feast, and there is something about Harvest Home about it. But it's about basic things about our lives and the people of special value. And the reason it's the highest traveling day for the airlines of the whole year, not even Christmas is because it's families trying to get back together. So we have to treasure that. But how much Thanksgiving goes on, I'm not sure. This picture from Nessville, Pennsylvania, the Lutheran church there is St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Nessville, a huge congregation now, but I don't know whether they were Lutherans or they were just praying at Thanksgiving. And then you see people standing in line and forming in what looks like pretty much a fundamentalist operation in Eugene, Oregon, so it still goes on. I told you I wanted to get back to Penns Valley. I got to do it quickly. That was the visit back to Penns Valley. How do we get it back? How do we get it back? How do we spiritualize what Black Friday, which takes our attention sometime now by noonday on Thanksgiving, how do we take it back? How do we get that emotion about gratitude to God back again? Lou, and I'm going to call him Lou, you wouldn't know him anyway, but I'll call him Lou, was a member of the Candidacy Committee of the Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Synod, and before I was elected bishop, I served as chairman for a number of years of the Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Candidacy Committee. The Candidacy Committee interviews and stays with for a period of 4 years every candidate for a ministry in the ELCA. It becomes a pretty significant kind of conversation and an in-depth relationship, and what it measures is whether this person, a candidate for a ministry in this church, is equipped spiritually, emotionally, to be a pastor, or to be a servant in the church, a musician. The Panabakers are deacons in the church. They met with that committee and got through it. Lou was a man of color. He was a perennial member of the committee. He was a member of the Maryland committee before he became a member of the Delaware, of the Washington, D.C. committee. Lou never said much. He read every paper the candidates wrote. He read transcripts from colleges and seminaries. He had his homework done to nines. But he never said much. Sooner or later, he would say this: Mark, tell me, how's your walk with Jesus? It was a showstopper when you're talking about academic credits, and when you're talking about papers that are written, and when we're talking about next steps in the candidacy process. It's all pretty technical stuff. And then somebody says, you know, I used to have one of those, but I made an ashtray out of it, or something else that doesn't make any sense. Mark, tell me, how's your walk with Jesus going? Some students, particularly in the second and third and fourth year, handled it fastly. They knew it was coming. Some others stumbled around. But you know what? The answers we got talked about prayer life. Almost infinite. When we walk with somebody, we talk, don't we? We hear all kinds of stories. They're friends. So the question Lou was asking over and again, Mark, Sarah, Bill, tell me about your prayer life. How's your walk with Jesus? That would get us back home again, folks. If our prayer life is active, we are comfortable with God. Lou understood that. And he taught it to every seminarian who ever went through that process. Thank you for being so attentive, and let you go. And one more crack, and this will be on Christ the King Day, which is